Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for international economics. And in this particular video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at deriving a home country's import demand, i.e. their demand for imported goods. We're also going to derive the foreign country's export supply, so their supply of exported goods. And then we're going to use import demand and export supply to determine the equilibrium in the world market. So the piece of information that we have in front of us right here is we're looking at the home country. So here we have the demand at home and the supply at home. So this is domestic supply and demand. And this is the price of this particular commodity that is being determined at the home country. So this is the market equilibrium for this product in the home country. If the world price happens to be equal to the equilibrium price in this home country, there will be no demand for imported goods, because at that price the domestic suppliers are producing the exact amount that domestic demanders want. So at this particular price we could transfer this over as this point right there. And actually, let me change the color of that. Let me pull that up. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do, folks. Again, not what I wanted to do. Didn't want that. I was changing the canvas style. That was a big mistake on my part. There we go. Apologies for that. As I said previously, this program can be a little glitchy sometimes. Actually, that wasn't a glitch. That was just a mistake on my part. So at a price of PA, the equilibrium price that exists in this economy, there will be no demand for imported goods. So at PA, the quantity demanded of imported goods is equal to 0. Let's lower the price and see what happens to import demand. So let's lower the price to here, and let us call that, I'm going to cheat and copy and paste this over. I'll call it P1. So this is a price below the equilibrium price in this home economy, and the price in the world is below that. So if we take a look at this, we can see that now that there is a difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied domestically. That's the level of demand for this particular product at that price. And here is the level that domestic firms are willing to supply. So we can call this D1. Let me change the font of that and type. That's a little big. Let me bring that down to 24. There we go. So that is at P1, at the price 1, this is how much domestic consumers wish to purchase, and this is the level that domestic suppliers are actually producing at that price. So let me change the font of that. So you can see that what is occurring is that domestic consumers are going to demand more than is being produced by domestic producers. So if we take D1 and subtract S1 from that, that gives us the import demand at that price, which is right there. So as you can see, I just made this so this was a 1 unit difference. So at P1, import demand is equal to 1 unit. And we can do this even further. Let's bring this price all the way down to here. And actually, let me stretch this over to there so it's easier to see. And let me do the same thing, and let me do this for a price that's this low. And this will be out to this point. Let me move that D down so it's easier to see. And let us call this price P2, sub 2. And again, let me change the font size and the actual font. So that is P2. So that at P2, what do we end up seeing? We see that consumers are demanding this quantity right there. So we can label that D2. Again, change the font. And we also have S2. So let me make sure I've got that labeled appropriately. S2. So as we lower the price even further down to P2, we can see that the quantity demanded domestically is D2. The quantity supplied domestically is S2. So if I subtract D2 from S2, that will give me the import demand at the price P2. And as you can see, that is equal to 3 units. So I have 1, 2, 3 units. I can put that point right there. And if I connect those 3 and change that to a solid line, this is import demand. And let me actually move that a little bit away so it's easier to see. And let me change the color of it to green. I believe it was green in your textbook. There we go. So you can see that by using domestic supply and demand, we can derive the import demand for that home economy. And realizing that at a price, a world price that is equivalent to the home market equilibrium, there is going to be 0 import demand. But as prices fall, import demand is going to increase. So we have a downward sloping import demand curve. We can do the same thing for export supply. Here we're going to be looking at a foreign country. So here's the supply and demand curves domestically for this foreign country, and let's assume that the world price is equivalent to the equilibrium price in this economy. So if the world price is equal to the equilibrium price in this particular marketplace, export demand is going to be equal to 0. Because at that price, at that world price, the quantity demanded domestically and the quantity supplied domestically are equivalent to one another. Therefore, there is no need or there is no impetus for these firms to export this particular commodity. Now, let's raise the price up and see what that does. So let's raise the price up to that level. Let me change that to a dotted line to make it consistent. And here I'm going to say this is equal to P1. So P sub 1, change the font so it matches. So that is what we have at P1. So at P1, if we take a look at this, we see that as the price goes above the domestic equilibrium, we see that domestic demand is decreasing, or the quantity demanded is decreasing, and the domestic quantity supplied is increasing. So at this higher price, there is going to be a supply of exported goods. And we can calculate this by going from that price straight down from the demand curve. So that gives us D1, D sub 1. Let me make sure that that's the right font again for consistency purposes. All right, and we can do the same exact thing for supply. And this will be equal to S1. Make it S sub 1, and again, make sure that the font is the same. So you can see here, as the price goes above the world price goes above the domestic equilibrium price, we see that the quantity supplied domestically is greater than the quantity demanded domestically. So that is the export supply. So at P1, it is going to be equal to S1 minus D1. And in this instance here, it is exactly equal to 1 unit. So I have a point at P1 where the export supply for this foreign country is going to be equal to 1. And I could continue this upward, do the same exact thing. I'll do it for a price up here. And actually, let me move that point over so it's a little bit easier to see. And I'll bring this point over to 3, a Q of 3, because I know that that's what's going to be the answer. So here we have an even higher price of P2. P sub 2. So at that price, we can make a determination of what domestic demand and supply, quantity demanded and quantity supplied, is going to be. So if we go from that price over to the domestic demand, this tells us what the quantity demanded is going to be equal to. So I will label that D sub 2. So that gives us, did not want to do that, hold on. There we go. So we have D sub 2, that is just where that world price of P2 intersects domestic demand. So this is the quantity demanded domestically. I can do the same thing with supply. I go where P2 intersects the domestic supply curve. Let me move this Q out of the way so it's a little easier to see. And this will give me the domestic supply 2, which is how the quantity supply that's going to occur at P2. So you can see here that at P2, domestic suppliers are going to want to produce S2. Domestic demanders are only going to want to purchase D2. So if we take S2 and subtract D2, that'll tell us the exports, the quantity of exports at a world price of P2. And as you can see, that is equal to 3 units. So those are our 3 points. We can connect those 3 points together. And again, let's make that a solid line. And I believe your textbook has this as a red color. So let me pull that up to make it consistent with your textbook. There we go. And let me label that XS for export supply. Let me change the font there, make it consistent again. So that is our export supply. So we realize that what we did here is we started at a point where the world equilibrium, the world price was equal to this foreign country's domestic market equilibrium price. At that, when they are equivalent, they have no export supply. The domestic quantity demanded is exactly equivalent to the domestic demand. But as the world price migrates upward, we can see that in that marketplace, that domestic supply is going to exceed domestic demand, and that is going to give us the quantity that is supplied in that is going to be supplied in the export market. And as we see, as the price migrates upward, the quantity for export supply increases. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the information from those previous 2 graphs that I had up there to do our world equilibrium. And actually, let me delete this information out of here. We really don't need this. I'm still going to include things on the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the import demand and paste that into this graph here. And then I'm going to copy export supply and paste that into this graphic. So the world equilibrium is going to occur where export supply is equivalent to export demand. So I just took the information from the previous slides and pasted them on here. So the equilibrium world market price is going to be the level where import demand and export supply are equal to one another. Let me change the color of that so it's consistent. So this is going to be the price in the world change the font of that. And here's going to be the equilibrium quantity exchanged in the world. So that is going to be QW. And again, we make sure that the fonts are equivalent to one another. So that is how the world equilibrium is determined. It's where the export supply curve for a commodity intersects the import demand curve. That gives us the price in the world and the quantity in the world also. So make sure you're comfortable with that. I know there were several layers. I thought it would be convenient to do all of these together. Make sure you understand each of the component parts, how the import demand for the home country was derived, how the foreign country's export supply curve was derived, and how using both the export demand and the export supply and the import demand curves intersect one another, give us the equilibrium quantity and price in the world market.